There were two world wars in incredibly quick succession in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, between 1914 and 1945, the entire global system just completely collapsed. Twice.
Yeah, resulting in tens of millions of casualties.
Yeah.
Just unparalleled destruction.
Exactly. And, to anyone living through the aftermath of the Second World War, a third massive conflict felt like, well, a historical inevitability. So the ultimate question we really have to grapple with today is, why hasn't it happened?
It is arguably the fundamental mystery of the modern era. And the conventional wisdom usually just defaults to pointing at the invention of nuclear weapons, right?
Right.
Like assuming the sheer terror of mutually assured destruction just single-handedly froze great power conflict. But the architecture that has actually prevented World War III is it's vastly more complex than just the existence of the atom bomb. You really have to look at the very machinery of the state system itself.
Welcome to our summer series on diplomacy and international relations. Whether you are a student deep into your studies or just a professional analyzing the shifting tectonic plates of international politics, this series is designed to critically examine the absolute foundational theories of IR.
And we are super excited to get into it.
Yes, we are. And a quick reminder, make sure to follow and subscribe. Also, you can join our Patreon community to help keep the show running. Plus, that gets you access to extra episodes and our highly requested weekly and monthly briefings on Danish politics. The link for that is right in the description.
Highly recommend checking that out.
Definitely. So today we are tracing the origin story of our modern global system, and we're using Chapter 2 of Foundations of International Relations, which is edited by Stephen McGlinchey, as our source text. Our mission today is to examine how the concept of the state was actually forged, how it was weaponized, and how the international community has desperately tried to build guardrails around it.
Yeah, and to understand those guardrails, we actually have to look at exactly when international relations became a formalized academic discipline in the first place.
Right, which wasn't actually that long ago, historically speaking.
No, not at all. It was formalized in 1919 at Aberystwyth, which is the University of Wales, and it was entirely a trauma response to the First World War.
Just sheer panic.
Exactly. The scholars who gathered there weren't, driven by abstract academic curiosity. They were driven by an existential panic. They were tasked with engineering a theoretical framework that could explain the structural causes of warfare and, well, theoretically prevent it from ever happening again.
But I mean, the framework they tried to build in 1919 clearly failed,
Yeah.
right? Because literally 2 decades later, the Second World War resulted in roughly 75 million deaths,
Yeah.
which, just to put that in perspective, was about 3% of the entire global population at the time. So the scholars realized that industrial-scale warfare wasn't just some, glitch in the global system.
Right. It was the system working exactly as it was historically designed to work.
Exactly. So to fix it, they had to understand the primary actor waging those wars, which is the sovereign nation-state. And to do that, that means rewinding past the world wars entirely, all the way back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Yeah, Westphalia. It's often treated as just this historical trivia point, like a treaty that ended the incredibly bloody 30 Years' War in Europe. But its real legacy is that it fundamentally altered the locus of authority in the world.
How so?
Well, before 1648, Europe basically operated under this super messy, overlapping web of feudal obligations. Plus, you had religious oversight from the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. The borders were entirely fluid, and authority was it was completely ambiguous.
So it's kind of like, imagine a massive, chaotic house with no assigned rooms, right? Everyone is just constantly fighting over space because nobody knows whose stuff is whose.
That is a great way to look at it, yeah.
And then Westphalia basically comes in, draws the floor plan, and puts locks on all the doors. It stripped away that universal religious oversight and replaced it with territorial exclusivity. Whoever rules a specific territory has absolute authority within those borders, free from outside interference, which basically gives birth to sovereignty.
Okay, let's unpack this, because having a legally defined border on a map doesn't magically guarantee your survival.
No, it definitely does not.
So how does a state actually enforce and maintain that sovereign status in practice?
Right, so in the modern international system, achieving and maintaining recognized sovereignty requires passing 2 continuous structural benchmarks. First, the state must maintain an internal monopoly on legitimacy and authority.
Meaning no one inside the house is trying to overthrow you. Exactly. There can't be any significant domestic competition actively challenging who holds the reins of government. And, it doesn't actually matter if the government is a liberal democracy where power transfers peacefully, or if it's a brutal authoritarian regime. The crucial factor is just that the internal question of command is settled.
Got it. And the second benchmark is external autonomy, right?
Yes. The state has to be free from any outside power actively claiming ownership or exerting direct administrative control over its territory. You literally have to pass both of those tests simultaneously.
The source material actually highlights South Sudan in 2011 as a textbook example of this mechanism working legally and peacefully.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Because South Sudan formally seceded from the broader state of Sudan. But crucially, the existing Sudanese government did not contest the secession.
Right, they let them go.
Exactly. So there was no internal competition remaining and no external power laid claim to the new borders. South Sudan immediately met both benchmarks, and boom, they became the newest recognized sovereign state in the global system.
What's fascinating here is that the map is entirely fluid, right?
Yeah.
Like, sovereignty is frequently violated. Just look at Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Oh, absolutely.
That is a direct external violation of Ukraine's territorial autonomy. Absorbing a region by force fundamentally challenges that whole Westphalian norm that borders are supposed to be inviolable.
And we also see sovereignty rewritten from the inside all the time.
Right.
Like successful revolutions. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 or the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they demonstrate how an internal competitor can completely dismantle the existing leadership and forge an entirely new sovereign identity over the exact same geographic territory.
Yeah, and honestly, the sheer scale of how much the map has fractured and expanded over the last century is staggering.
Right.
I mean, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, there were fewer than 70 recognized nation-states.
Wow, only 70.
Yeah. And today, there are nearly 200.
That's a massive jump.
It is. And this massive proliferation was driven primarily by decolonization. As European empires collapsed, the United Nations essentially oversaw the transition of former colonies into independent entities. But the catch is that the international system basically forced these incredibly diverse regions to adopt the rigid European Westphalian model of the nation-state. It was their only path to recognized independence.
Which explains so many ongoing territorial conflicts today, because the Westphalian model often forced arbitrary borders over really complex ethnic, cultural, and religious realities.
Exactly. Consequently, there are numerous entities operating today in a state of geopolitical limbo.
Like Taiwan, right?
Taiwan, Kosovo, the Republic of Somaliland. These are territories that function like states in many capacities, but they face severe internal or external contestations that prevent them from achieving universal sovereign recognition. They are living proof that sovereignty is not a permanent guarantee, it's an ongoing performance.
Okay, so we arrive at a highly volatile scenario by the mid-20th century. The global system has expanded from 70 states to nearly 200, and every single one of them is operating under this Westphalian imperative of self-preservation, a system that historically basically guarantees violent competition.
Yep, it's a recipe for disaster.
And then you have the two dominant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in this intense ideological struggle for global influence. If the system is literally designed to produce conflict, why didn't the Cold War go hot?
Because the underlying mathematics of warfare fundamentally changed in August 1945. The introduction of nuclear weapons shifted the entire strategic paradigm from offensive victory to defensive deterrence.
Right. Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. The logic of deterrence dictates that if a state possesses a weapon system capable of entirely annihilating an adversary, particularly if that system can survive an initial surprise attack and launch a devastating second strike well, the adversary is forced to remain rational. The risk of total societal collapse just completely outweighs any potential political or territorial gain.
But relying on the assumption that state leaders will always remain perfectly rational that is a massive gamble.
Oh, totally.
And the mechanisms of deterrence nearly failed during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union positioned nuclear warheads just, 150 kilometers off the American coast, the strategic calculus completely broke down.
It really did.
The standoff between Kennedy and Khrushchev wasn't resolved by the threat of mutually assured destruction. The threat is what caused the crisis in the first place.
Right. It was resolved through frantic back-channel diplomacy. The Soviets eventually agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. quietly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and they actually had to utilize the United Nations to independently verify compliance. Because the baseline of trust was literally zero.
Which is terrifying.
It was a terrifying brush with total annihilation. And it forced the international community to institutionalize safeguards, which led to the 1970 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT.
Right.
The architecture of the NPT is widely considered this triumph of pragmatic diplomacy, precisely because it accepted the harsh reality of global power dynamics rather than just, striving for a utopian disarmament.
Okay, but I have to challenge the premise that the NPT is a pure diplomatic triumph. Because when you look at the actual structure of the treaty, it's inherently hypocritical.
Well, sure.
It essentially institutionalized a permanent nuclear aristocracy. It legally permitted 5 states, the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and China, to retain their apocalyptic arsenals, while permanently forbidding every other sovereign state on Earth from acquiring that same defensive capability.
That is true.
In a Westphalian system where all sovereign states are supposedly legally equal, the NPT explicitly codified inequality.
It absolutely codified inequality. But the architects of the treaty understood that absolute equality would lead to catastrophic proliferation. The grand bargain of the NPT was an exchange of capabilities.
Meaning they traded tech for compliance.
Exactly. The recognized nuclear states promised to share peaceful, non-military nuclear technology. So, for energy grids and medical research, with any state that agreed to forego weapons development.
It was a highly calculated trade-off. Surrender the ultimate military deterrent in exchange for guaranteed technological and economic advancement.
And I guess strategically it worked. It did. Rather than the dozens of nuclear-armed states that mid-century analysts predicted we'd have by now, we have fewer than 10 today. The NPT succeeded in establishing non-proliferation as a binding international norm.
The NPT also perfectly illustrates this concept of polarity, right? Like how power is structurally distributed within the global system.
Right. Polarity is key here.
Because the Cold War was defined by strict bipolarity, 2 massive gravitational centers dictating the alignment of almost every other state. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, power consolidated into what political scientists call the unipolar moment.
Yeah, with the United States acting as the sole unchallenged hegemon.
But unipolarity is inherently unstable. And the text highlights how we have transitioned into a much more fragmented reality. Scholar Amitav Acharya describes our current era not just as multipolar, but as multiplexity.
Multiplexity is such a vital concept for understanding contemporary international relations. It moves beyond the idea of just having 3 or 4 dominant military superpowers competing for territory. A multiplex order operates like, well, a massive multiplex cinema.
With lots of different screens playing different movies.
Yes. You have multiple, distinctly different systems of governance, trade, and diplomacy running simultaneously under one global roof. Power is dispersed across state governments, but also across transnational corporations, regional alliances like the European Union or ASEAN, and vast networks of non-governmental organizations.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the primary mechanism connecting these disparate theaters in the multiplex is economic globalization. The integration of global supply chains serves as this incredibly powerful friction point against state aggression.
It's a huge deterrent.
Going to war in a multiplex system doesn't just mean risking military defeat anymore. It means initiating your own immediate economic collapse. And we saw the fragility of these networks during the COVID-19 pandemic. When borders slammed shut, the manufacturing of necessary medical supplies, electronics, and basic commodities just ground to a halt because the components were sourced from dozens of different countries.
Yeah, modern states are fundamentally reliant on their adversaries for their own economic survival.
Which is wild to think about. And in addition to that complex economic interdependence, the multiplex era is defined by the democratization of communication. The proliferation of digital media and instant global connectivity makes it significantly harder for state apparatuses to control narratives and dehumanize foreign populations.
Right, because when citizens can witness the lived reality of people on the other side of the planet in real time through their smartphones, empathy actually begins to act as a soft deterrent against the state's traditional monopoly on violence.
But all of these macro-level systems, the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, globalized supply chains, the multiplex dispersal of power, they all still fundamentally rely on the sovereign state as the primary unit of international relations.
They do.
Which exposes the most dangerous flaw in the Westphalian architecture. What happens when the threat to a population isn't a foreign army, but their own sovereign government. If a state possesses absolute authority within its borders, how does the international system respond when that state turns its monopoly on violence against its own citizens?
And that tension forced the most profound evolution in modern international relations. The elevation of the individual human being as a recognized actor on the global stage.
So we've talked about the state, we've talked about the international system. Let's do a little simulated interview segment here. Let's look at the individual. I'll play the inquisitive student, and you put on the hat of an IR educator.
Sounds good. I am ready.
All right, question one. How did the horrors of World War II actually change the rules for individual humans?
The catalyst was, again, the unprecedented trauma of the Second World War. The revelation of the Holocaust, the systematic industrialized extermination of 6 million Jewish people and millions of other minorities by the Nazi regime, it completely shattered the illusion that sovereign authority could be morally absolute. It necessitated a fundamental shift in international law, which culminated in the United Nations adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948.
And that 1948 declaration was philosophically revolutionary.
Right.
It established for the very first time an international benchmark, stating that all human beings are born with inherent rights and dignity, completely independent of their citizenship or the state they happen to reside in. But here's question two. If states hold absolute sovereignty, isn't the UN essentially powerless to enforce human rights? Because declaring a right on paper is entirely different from enforcing it. The UN is not a global government. It doesn't have a standing army. If a state just ignores the declaration and commits atrocities behind locked borders, the UN is structurally powerless to physically stop them without violating Westphalian sovereignty.
This raises an important question, because that exact contradiction paralyzed the international community for decades. How do you intervene to stop a genocide without destroying the legal foundation of state sovereignty that prevents larger wars?
Right.
The theoretical breakthrough came in 2005, when the UN endorsed the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which is commonly known as R2P. R2P fundamentally redefines the nature of sovereignty. The source text uses this brilliant, practical analogy. It asks us to view sovereignty not as an inherent divine right of the state, but as a mortgage issued by the international community.
I love this analogy. So, if sovereignty is a mortgage, then the state is the homeowner, and the international community represented by the UN is the bank.
Right.
As long as the state maintains its property and protects the citizens living inside it, it's effectively making its moral repayments. The bank respects the state's autonomy and leaves them alone. But if the state begins systematically abusing its population, committing war crimes, or engaging in ethnic cleansing, the state goes into moral default.
Exactly. Under R2P, when a state defaults on its responsibility to protect its citizens, the international community has the legal and moral authority to step in and effectively foreclose on that state's sovereignty. This intervention can escalate from diplomatic sanctions all the way to authorized military force. The goal is to neutralize the internal threat and protect the vulnerable population. It asserts that human rights actually supersede territorial rights when the abuses reach a critical threshold.
Okay, question three then. Do people actually use this in the real world, or is it just academic theory?
It's very real. We've seen this norm penetrate far beyond academic theory. During the 2021 military coup in Myanmar, for example, everyday citizens protesting the junta were literally photographed holding up cardboard signs, specifically pleading for R2P intervention. They understood the mechanisms of international law and were actively demanding that the global community honor its stated responsibilities.
But the operational reality of R2P is intensely complicated, isn't it? Because authorized military intervention requires approval from the UN Security Council.
Yeah, that's the catch.
And any of the 5 permanent members who, not coincidentally, are the 5 recognized nuclear powers from the NPT, can just veto the intervention to protect their own geopolitical interests, regardless of the humanitarian crisis on the ground.
Which perfectly illustrates why studying international relations requires looking at both the lofty theoretical frameworks and the grim, pragmatic realities of how power is actually wielded. We have transitioned from a world where states fought over territory with impunity to this complex, multiplex system bound by economic interdependence, the terror of nuclear weapons, and the rising normative power of human rights.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize the core mechanics we have analyzed today into 3 essential takeaways for your own continued study of the global system. First, while the sovereign nation-state remains the dominant actor in international politics, its absolute supremacy is steadily eroding.
Yeah, the rigid Westphalian model is being squeezed from above by transnational organizations and global supply chains, and from below by the universal assertion of individual human rights. The state is just no longer the sole variable in the geopolitical equation.
Right. Second takeaway. Sovereignty is never permanently secured. It requires passing two tests, constantly defeating internal competition and retelling external control. It is a precarious condition. The map of the world is perpetually drafted in pencil, constantly subjected to internal revolutions and external contestations.
And third, the long peace we have experienced regarding major great power conflicts since 1945 is not a natural byproduct of human progress.
Definitely not.
It is an actively engineered, highly artificial architecture. It's maintained daily by a delicate web of nuclear deterrence, formalized treaties, the economic friction of multiplex globalization, and the evolving moral parameters of international law.
Understanding those macro-level frameworks is absolutely crucial, but applying them to specific regional realities is where the actual work of diplomacy happens. And if you want to actively apply these analytical frameworks to specific dynamic environments, make sure you explore our Patreon community.
Yes, your support directly sustains this series.
And it grants you access to our exclusive weekly and monthly briefings that dissect how these exact international pressures influence Danish politics and regional European strategies. The link to join is right in the description.
Because applying these theories to the real world reveals just how fragile that artificial architecture actually is. The systems we rely on to prevent a third world war are currently undergoing unprecedented stress tests.
Like the systemic shocks of the post-COVID era, they really expose the vulnerabilities in our multiplex network.
They absolutely have. When the pandemic threatened the fundamental survival of populations, we witnessed how rapidly the sophisticated web of global cooperation can just disintegrate. States instantly reverted to raw Westphalian self-interest.
Borders slammed shut.
Supply chains were weaponized. We saw fierce vaccine nationalism where powerful states hoarded life-saving resources for their own citizens, completely undermining international distribution initiatives and leaving less developed states to basically fend for themselves. It was a stark reminder that when the chips are down, the instinct for sovereign self-preservation overrides the commitment to global governance.
Which leaves us with a critical, unsettling question as we navigate the coming decades. If a severe, cascading global crisis, whether it be another pandemic, critical resource scarcity, or the accelerating impacts of climate change, forces states to instinctively retreat back toward rigid isolationism and zero-sum competition, will the intricate web of diplomacy, multiplex trade, and human rights actually be strong enough to hold them back?
Or is the international system standing on the precipice, ready to slide back into a volatile era of pure, unconstrained state conflict? It is the defining challenge for the next generation of diplomats, policymakers, and citizens. The mechanisms that prevented war in the 20th century may not be sufficient for the crises of the 21st.
A vital warning to keep at the forefront of our analysis. That concludes today's discussion on the foundations of international relations. If you found this exploration valuable, please make sure to follow the series on your preferred platform and leave us a 5-star rating. It is the most effective way to help these discussions reach a wider audience. Join us next time as we continue our summer series where we will take the conventional origin story we built today and actively deconstruct it, examining the critical blind spots and voices ignored by the traditional Westphalian narrative. Until then, keep questioning the map.